Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. What's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
Both you and I have bought several houses in our lifetimes.
Indeed, I have.
And it's astounding to me, the paperwork that's involved. You have to schedule the closing, sign like 20 documents. I don't understand why there can't just be one document that says, I agree to everything in the packet.
They sent somebody over to the house knowing it was going to take forever, and she showed up with a 5-inch stack of papers.
Yeah, that's about right.
After about the first half inch, I completely lost interest and just started signing things.
I wonder if it's ever been tested in court, because we do this all the time, right down to the
Right.
end
User
license
right?
agreements.
That's right.
You know, who knows what you're agreeing to?
iTunes can say whatever the hell it wants in that big, long thing that nobody ever reads because, I'm just going to click agree at the end anyway.
But you may have had the experience I did at least one, actually twice when I bought houses. I got the financing all arranged and I was locked into some interest rate. The lock was good for whatever it was, a week, 2 weeks, something like that. And they end up dragging the thing out. I can't get a hold of the guy, and there's some extra paperwork he needs that I already sent it to him. And clearly they're dragging it out until the interest rates rise. And then the lock is broken. It ends up costing me an extra 0.5% interest on the mortgage.
Which is not insignificant.
Yeah, which is not insignificant. But what's evolved is this situation in which if you go to buy a house, if you can pay cash, you get priority over other people who may be offering more money but aren't paying cash, simply because the whole deal gets done. What's also going on here is you can have a chain of events where person A is selling his house to person B is selling his house to C is selling it to D, and if person A at the beginning of the chain can't get financing, the rest of the chain breaks down.
I have waited with bated breath on many house purchases on the part of strangers I never met.
Yeah, exactly. So if you can come to the table with cash, it makes all these problems go away. And it turns out that the sellers are willing to take a lesser amount of cash than a greater amount of money that's pledged via financing. But here's the interesting thing. It turns out that the market is addressing this problem. There are businesses now that will pay cash for you. The way this works is you say, okay, I'm going to pay X dollars for this house and I'm going to go through the regular financing, but you, Mr. Seller, you don't worry about that because from your perspective, I'm paying cash. I've got this business on the back end here that's going to put the cash up for me. So in effect, what's happening is that business is going to pay cash for the house, then turn right around and resell the house to me when I get my financing. And of course, they're going to charge me because of that, but the benefit to me is it's 4 times as likely that you would accept my offer given that I'm bringing cash to the table.
All this kind of hurts my brain.
But on the one hand, it's astounding how complicated it gets. On the other, it's typical market reaction that some entrepreneur saw a pain point here, this pain of us trying to deal with the mortgages, stepped in and said, I can solve that problem for you.
Right, and the pain point is always exactly the same. It's when the paperwork goes to a mythical place called underwriting. And whoever works in that cave starts asking a bunch of irrelevant questions and needs documentation for the answers.
But in looking at this, there's an article I'll put in the show notes that describes this whole complicated business. There's an interesting quote in this article. It says this company that will pay the cash for you for the house will not pay more than what the house is worth. That is, they do their own analysis in the back, say the house is worth $200,000. That's the most we're going to lend you. Any reasonable person can look at that and say, well, yeah, of course, it makes sense. You wouldn't loan more than what the house is worth. And yet, we never ask that question with college loans.
Not with college loans.
Only with somebody ask that question with respect to a college loan, we wouldn't have the problems we're currently having.
Right, but you lock in a price with the seller, and then the bank or the mortgage company has to come out and assess the house. And miraculously, the house is always worth exactly what the two parties agreed to. The bank people never say, oh God, you're crazy. No, it's all a big sham to begin with.
But here's a third party in this situation now that actually has an incentive to get the value of that house right. Because if it turns out that you, Mr. Buyer, actually can't afford it, I, who am only in the business putting the cash down on the table for 48 hours, all of a sudden I end up owning a house that I don't want to own.
And I'm going to bring us all the way over to Saudi Arabia. I go to this thing called the Straits Times, which I had never until today heard of, but it is the English flagship daily newspaper in Singapore. The title is enough to send you scratching your head. Giant rave in Saudi desert pushes kingdom's changing boundaries.
First off, rave in a Saudi country. Second, in the desert.
Well, Burning Man is in the desert, so maybe they're taking their lesson from that. I'm pretty sure I can speak for Ant here. We've never been to a rave.
No.
I've been invited, but I turned that invitation down. Why? Because my back hurt and I had to get home and lie down. Right? So there you go. But this rave in the Saudi desert attracted 180,000 people.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, they're not kidding around when they say giant. If you could have imagined 180,000 Saudis coming together in the desert where they were drinking, smoking the weed, having inappropriate sexual encounters, even the gays were there. Gay people in Saudi Arabia, that's a real pressure point there. And apparently one of the princes came too and had a lovely time.
Huh.
Something's changing here. And how do you know? Because it's changing in exactly the way it always does. This is a pop culture phenomenon that you're looking at. Pop culture is a leading indicator. If you want to know what's going to be widely accepted in a few to 20 years, get a good look at what is pushing the envelope in terms of pop culture. And there's going to be your answer. I am remarkably heartened by seeing this in a place where we don't typically see these sorts of things. Hats off to the Saudis at the rave. I'm never going to go to one, but I wish you well and hope you all have a good time.
If you're right about this, that pop culture is the leading force, I wonder if historians will look back and see the internet in a way that we don't see it. That is, it's become this global system for disseminating culture.
That's right. It beams what it beams to everyone.
Yeah.
And they consume it as they wish. Look at North Korea, and they know good and well what the problem is going to be here for them. Right. So
they'll be having nothing of that internet business.
That's right. You can't escape this. This is one of those things that's been set in motion, and it will roll inexorably to its end. Will it bring some new and exciting, terrible things? Yeah, it absolutely will. Will it free people in a significant way around the world? And yeah, it's going to do that too. The downside is that almost everywhere you look, you're going to see a McDonald's. The upside is that everywhere you look, you're going to see people freely choosing what they want. But this, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. I think it's kind of sad that it has to be Elizabeth Warren yet again. But the beautiful thing that happened this past week is that Elon Musk has had enough of her and her nonsense.
I know, he's taking her on Twitter.
And he's going to win every single time. Not 3 seconds after the words are out of her mouth, he's tweeting. And he made the case that this year he's going to pay $11 billion in taxes.
11 billion.
That's not his fair share, apparently. What is his fair share? I don't know, because at 11 billion, according to Musk, and I think it's right, he will pay more in taxes this year than any American ever has. We've got the richest man in the world paying the biggest tax bill in history, which is probably what most people would think appropriate, and yet it's still not enough for Elizabeth Warren and her crew. She never says what would be enough. Give us a percentage. Tell us what you think is the right answer. And until people do that, they're just blowing smoke.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. Last week's episode was Words and Numbers Live from Truman State University. A number of listeners wrote in saying they thoroughly enjoyed the episode, and so this week we'll be doing the Q&A session from that same Words and Numbers Live.
I hear China offered as an example of why more government intervention isn't necessarily a bad thing, because they do have a really authoritarian government and strong levels of economic intervention, and yet they've had so much growth in the past few decades. So, one, how do you respond to that? And two, I know you can't tell the future, but do you think that that growth is sustainable in any way?
There are two things going on here. One is China's huge growth is due in part to the fact that their economy was so small to begin with. Now, in terms of dollars, it's large, but on a per capita basis, which is what matters, it's very small compared to the U.S. So when you're very small, a little bit of growth shows up as a huge percentage, right? So that's one thing. But here's the other thing I think is more interesting. While China is, compared to the U.S., a very unfree country, since the 1980s, it has become much more free. So the growth that you're seeing is due to market freedoms that China has been putting in place over the past few decades. Now, what's going to be interesting is what happens over the next couple of decades, because politically, China of late has been cutting back on market freedoms. If that continues, my prediction is China's economy will stagnate. You won't see that kind of growth moving forward.
We're not China scholars, so we're probably not going to see this too terribly deeply. But every China scholar I meet, and there are quite a few in our circles, I always ask the same question. Is China communist or authoritarian capitalist? No one has ever said communist. So there you go. There's something on that growth side that they think they can manage with ham-fisted rules and regulations. And I think that's what they're bumping up against right now. There's only so far you can get if you go this way. And you're far better off telling people to just go do what it is they would like to do. But of course, for all kinds of social reasons, the Chinese will not do that. I pay attention more to the social index, things that control people, not in markets, but in their entire lives. To the extent that they can do that sort of thing, you'll see whatever growth they've had stop right in its tracks. Because you need a certain kind of freedom to arrive at that thing that markets can give you. You talk about economics and politics all the time. They are inextricably linked. The Chinese are going to figure it out easier, they're going to figure it out hard, but they will figure it out.
So you talked about how the profit incentive is sort of like positive to sustain a business, but do you think there are any like sectors or areas that would benefit from incentives other than profit in a free market economy?
Yeah. When an economist talks about a profit incentive, non-economists, I think, hear the wrong thing. They hear dollars. And that's not necessarily what an economist means by profit. Certainly dollars are a big part of it, but also satisfaction is part of it. If I am happy with growing Christmas trees and selling them, and I might not make much money from it, but I get tremendous satisfaction, an economist would look at that and call that profit. Now, it's not monetary profit, but it's profit in the sense that I have bettered myself, I'm happier than I was before. And that's what motivates me. All people are motivated ultimately by happiness. For some of us, dollars bring it, principally. For some of us, relationships bring it. For all of us, dollars are a portion of it. But the motivation is ultimately to become happier with ourselves, to become satisfied, and that's what we mean by profit motivation.
I think with the exception of Marx and every postmodern, every other philosopher says happiness is the goal of every action for a human being. This starts with Plato and Aristotle and goes right to yesterday. I've worked in nonprofits for a very long time. We talk about the balance sheet in the nonprofit. We don't call it profit, we call it revenues in excess of expenses, which last time I checked was profit. But because it's a not-for-profit, you can't use the word. So everywhere you look, you kind of see this same animal.
Do you think that there are cultural prerequisites for a free market system to develop? And what would you recommend for those countries that do not have those cultural prerequisites?
I don't know. My tendency is to say, no, there aren't prerequisites. Now, there are certain things that will make a free market economy more likely or less likely, but I think there aren't prerequisites. And the reason I say I don't think there are prerequisites is because the principles of a free market economy pre-exist governments. You'll see the principles at play with a single individual. You can have a 3-year-old kid and say, you can have your cookie now and take a nap, or you can not. You can go out and play, but no cookie for you. And the kid will make a decision using all of the tools that we think of when we think about free markets. When you have 2 neighbors and one of them is growing vegetables and the other one is mowing his lawn, and you say, hey, look, your lawn looks great. Can you do what you're doing over there here? And I'll grow some vegetables and we can exchange. That's a free market economy. So it occurs at the very basis of human interaction. To make it not a free market economy means adding something on top of that, where somebody says, no, you may not do that, or alternatively, you must do that.
And the word you used, prerequisite, that's a hard word to conquer. If you had asked if it was more likely in one place over another, I'd have said, yes, absolutely. What's my proof? Look at the British Empire. All the former states of the British Empire doing pretty well, comparatively speaking, especially the English-speaking former states. But then you take a look at what happened as the Soviet Union disappeared. I never would have guessed it was going to be Estonia that was going to be the great example of what's possible. And yet it is. It's so interesting that I kind of want to move there. So there are, I think, things that make more likely that you'll succeed. And I think that works on both the plus and the minus. So the United States, we exited the British Empire the way we did, and we were very successful. That's not the same as the Baltic republics, who lived under brutal communism for decades. We had it way better here. There's a time lag difference than they did, but maybe the prerequisite is that you lived under a brutal dictatorship. And the more you look at the underlying factors, the more you realize there's not one path to it. It's multiple paths. The story's going to be unique no matter where you go. The interesting thing here in the U.S., there was a guy in 1947 wrote The Liberal Tradition in America, and he observed that there has never been a communist party in America worth talking about. And that's right, there hasn't been. When asked why, he concluded that it was because we didn't have a feudal past. We didn't have any feudalistic history. And if you look at places that have strong communist parties, feudal every single time. And isn't that fascinating? But when you start to look for that one driver of political history, you're doomed never to find it. The answers are too rich and robust in nature to ever catch up with that way.
I think there is one thing that, now that you're asking the question, I'm thinking about it, is probably worth pursuing. And that's the question of whether you trust your neighbor. When there's a greater level of trust between people, markets are more likely to flourish. And I offer simply as a possible example what you see in this country. And again, with broad brush, largely speaking, you get more acceptance of free market principles in rural areas and more skepticism in high-density urban areas. And I can't help but think that it may have something to do with that in the rural areas, and I've lived in very rural areas for a long time, you trust your neighbors. You have to trust your neighbor. You regard government as intrusive. In a high-density urban area, and that's weird because I'm surrounded by far more people, but I don't know who my neighbors are, and my tendency may be to trust them less. And so I put my trust instead into government.
And it's interesting, right? Because what do you always hear? Somebody will go on the news channels and say, why do all you dumb rednecks not see that you shouldn't be Republicans? And the dumb rednecks, I don't understand the question. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly for the reason you're talking about. I think population density explains a lot. And it's weird. It ends up, I think, flipping our electoral politics a little bit, where people who you might assume would be a natural fit for one party or the other actually aren't. And you really have to peel away a lot of layers before you can figure out why that is.
So you were talking at the beginning about trade-offs of the lockdown, specifically depression, higher taxes, etc., and how kind of right now that's a controversial topic in areas. How I when I bring it up, it's always you don't care about life, blah blah blah, whatever. Do you think we will get to the point ever where we can talk about these trade-offs and maybe not criticize, but critically examine the trade-off of locking down? And if so, what do we need to conquer to get to that point?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's more likely that we have civil conversations about lockdown now that we're talking about a second one, because we have the first one to look back on. I can say things this time around to skeptics that I couldn't say last time. I was very hesitant last time to say things like, look, if we lock down, people are going to die because of suicide. They're going to die because of domestic violence. Because as soon as I said the words, we can't lock down, immediately I'm a baby killer. You just want people to die. You're only interested in turning a profit, keeping the economy going. Now that we've been through it and we've seen the negatives as well as the positives, I think that people will listen. And vice versa. There were things that people on the other side said that I didn't want to listen to. That now that I look at the number of excess deaths, I'm more interested in hearing. In that sense, all of us on both sides are more mature, more able to handle a civil conversation on at least that topic.
It gets pretty easy to say things like, look, during that last lockdown we had, people who were most vocally in favor of it owned homes, had a job they could do remotely, They didn't pay a terrible price the way typically younger people in the economy did. People who couldn't make the rent, people who had to put off home ownership 2 more years now, plus however long it takes us to rebound. And I think all of us knew early on that depression was going to be an issue. I think almost everybody saw that. The thing that caught me unaware was how many older people our age and older, didn't go in for routine checks on all kinds of things that will now kill them. And the death toll from COVID is going to be felt not right now, but in about 5 years. I would have bet my life that we had a baby boom after this. But it turns out people are just aggravated living with each other and never leaving the house. And that matters. I actually have a pretty big house. If I'm at one end and the wife is at the other, we can't even hear each other, which I find to be perfect. But the year before, we lived in a very, very small rental. And I think we might have killed each other. The children, every one of them has independently said, thank God we don't live at that last place. Because it matters. If you're stacked on top of each other and there's no natural daylight coming into the home, you might be miserable in a way that you can't recover. I think people are more mature about it in the technical sense of the word. We all know more. Whether we'll be able to talk about it reasonably or not, I'm not certain. I tend to start with, you know what I didn't get right? And then people say, yeah, you were stupid. I didn't get right this other thing. And the minute I think you can make it clear that none of us really knew what to expect, it's a lot easier to talk about it reasonably.
What helps a lot, and I hope that we've learned this on both sides, is not to vilify the other side. We have this tendency, I say we because it happens on both sides, we have this tendency to assume ill intent on the part of the other person. If you don't agree with me, it's because you value profits over people, or it's because you're a tree-hugging idiot, or whatever it is, right? We assume ill intent, when in fact, on, I would say, virtually all issues, or maybe 99.9% of issues, left and right agree on the outcome. We all agree that our streets should be safer, our children should be better educated, more people should have health insurance, people should earn a living wage. We all agree on that. But we never get to the point of understanding that we agree on it, because as soon as we disagree on the means to the end, we assume that the other person is either stupid or evil.
That's right. We have a means problem.
Yes.
We don't have an ends problem.
Yes.
If you can just cut loose from the language we use to discuss these things, you'll realize that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, how can we make all those school children dumber? How can we make the roads less safe? Nobody thinks this way. We really are on that same path. It's just we can't find a common language. And I think that does us a lot of harm.
Do you guys have any ideas on why there is a disconnect between understanding trade-offs on a personal level and then kind of why we don't apply that to government and politics?
I think we don't apply it to government and politics for 2 reasons. One, it's harder to see the trade-off when we're talking about government decisions because it's not us making it. It's easy for me to say college should be free when I don't have to think about how ultimately we'd end up paying for it. It's the same way as when I was a teenager, I'd say, I want to own that sports car. That's easy for me to say. I had no concept of what a job or a mortgage or caring for children was. It wasn't until I was older I realized, wait a minute, here's the trade-off, that I would make a different decision. So that's one thing. I think there's another thing at play here, and that is, remember that politicians' goals are not to solve our problems. It's to solve their problems. In that, they are exactly like we are. Their problem is how to get elected. And if they're faced with an electorate that isn't digging down and looking at the full picture, they actually have a motivation to play on that and to not encourage you to think deeply. Because the more shallow your thinking is, the easier it is for me to convince you to vote for me, not that guy.
A lot of us here are economics students, and I think we all have gotten to a point at some point in our econ careers where we know why it's called the business of science. So what are each of you optimistic about moving forward, like on a broad scale?
In general, what I'm optimistic about, I'm going to say these words and I don't think you're going to believe me. What I'm optimistic about is that we have become, just in a short period of time, in the time that you've been alive, ungodly wealthy. And I'm not kidding you here. This is not hyperbole. This is straight up numbers. We are so wealthy that what today we call poverty, the poverty line, a century ago was middle class. We have become so wealthy that quite literally what we think is poverty, we used to think was middle class. In fact, the rest of the world today still thinks it's middle class. And this goes by decade after decade. It just gets better and better and better. But there's a flip side. There's something that makes me sad there. And the thing that makes me sad is we aren't aware of how wealthy we have become, in part because we aren't appreciative of this wealth. We take it for granted. You heard buzzing here a moment ago. That was my wife calling me from Pennsylvania at a marginal cost of zero. That is, given that the phone exists, she can call me up and I could have put it on and seen her face. I could have put up the microphone. You could have heard her voice from Pennsylvania. When I was 14 and I wanted to call my girlfriend who lived
Nope, you didn't have a girlfriend.
When I wanted to call the girl that I hoped was my girlfriend 7 miles away, it cost me in today's terms about 50 cents a minute to talk to her.
I actually remember $300 phone bills.
Yes.
When we moved to California and all of the families back in Connecticut.
And this is just one thing. You don't see it until you sit down and start looking. We talk about, for example, the massive cost of healthcare in this country, and I don't mean to minimize that. Healthcare is expensive. It's really stinking expensive. But what we get in exchange for it are cures for diseases. You can get over-the-counter cures for diseases that used to kill people. Go to a cemetery sometime and look at the stones that go back to the 1800s, and you'll see father, mother, and 5 or 6 children, many of them unnamed because they died so young. And that was a standard thing. Today, yes, it happens, but it isn't standard. It's very uncommon. Why? Because we've become so incredibly wealthy. We can cure for an expensive price what used to be a price of infinity because the thing didn't exist. I'll give you one example. Andrew Carnegie, who at the time, and adjusted for inflation, probably was the richest person who's ever lived. His mother died of tuberculosis. For all of his wealth, he couldn't save her. Today, even poor Americans can afford a cure for this. That's how ungodly rich we have become. And we don't appreciate it. We take it for granted. That's really sad.
I have a radically different answer. Ant said a couple of times here that he doesn't know his neighbors. I also don't know my neighbors. I moved in like 2 years ago. I have no idea what those people are even doing. And I think that's the greatest thing in the world. Bear with me for a second. It's the greatest thing in the world because we used to be forced to find some understanding of community with the people who lived within a stone's throw of ourselves. It was proximity. That was what community was. That's a pretty low, miserable ground for community. So much so that it's no longer the case. Where do I find community? I find it in the specialized electronic message boards that I'm on. I find it in my Zoom contacts. I find it at Words and Numbers Backstage, where we meet with people who we've never met in 3 dimensions. And everywhere I look, I'm deeply committed socially, and I can't touch anybody who fits that bill. We became so technologically adept, and we made things so easy that now community is people who I find interesting, not people who I'm just kind of forced to live next door to. And I think that's really something.
We've talked about how people would rather like a quick line for information when it comes to like relying on sources. And like, for example, people have really pushed the electric cars, but my brother did extensive research on it and found out that it takes like 10 years for the like payoffs of the electric car. Until then, though, it's like still damaging to the environment, and in some cases, even cars that run off of gas are still more environmentally safe. And so my question is there some way that we can try to align these incentives?
As long as you've got that technological impediment, I think you can't. My daughter has talked a lot about wanting to go buy electric cars. Turns out those batteries don't have a 10-year life cycle. So you're buying the car knowing that you'll never break even on it, right? That there's no way it's going to ever make financial sense. Meanwhile, what did you not do? You didn't look at things like motorbikes, which have pretty low emissions. You didn't look at cheap cars like the Kias and the Hyundais that actually run pretty clean and don't cost $1 billion to run. So when you ask if incentives can be aligned, I never even go near that question. I ask what incentives are, because I think it's naturally emergent. It's an emergent phenomenon. When you say, can we align them, I think what I hear is, can we get government to force you to do X? Probably not your intent, but it's right where my imagination goes every time.
But along those lines, what you can do is help to make sure that the incentives match the reality. And that involves things like not subsidizing. I count both the subsidization of the green energy and the subsidization of the oil companies. I'm against both of those equally. I'm against the oil companies being allowed to pollute and the liabilities being capped. They should be fully responsible for everything they do. If everybody's fully responsible for the decisions they make, I think we get much closer to the idea that you're trying to get at, that you're saying the word align incentives, but get people to the position where they're correctly weighing the trade-offs. The only way to do that is to make them responsible for their decisions.
My question's more for friendly advice when speaking with friends or coworkers or colleagues or whatever. Lots of people in my interactions sometimes be like, well, if we just tax the rich, or if the rich actually paid their taxes, we'd fix so many different things. How do you guys go about explaining that that's not going to solve everything? Or like a tax on the rich, or that's not going to give you free college? Kind of like you mentioned at the very beginning, it's not going to be the solution. How do you go about expressing that to people who, maybe especially people who don't have an economics background?
Where I typically start is with a reality check. Someone will say to me, well, the rich should pay more. They should pay their fair share, right? So one of the things I do, I've done this for over a decade now, asking students, everyone from high school all the way up to graduate students, I'll ask them the same question. I'll show the average income for the top 1%er, a middle-class American, and someone from the bottom 20%. And I'll ask, now tell me, what do you think a fair tax rate is if we were to tax these incomes fairly? And there's no right or wrong answer. It's simply your opinion as to what is fair. And to make it simple, I say, look, let's take into account all of deductions and write-offs and all this stuff. So do whatever your accounting gymnastics are. And when we're done, what fraction of your income should you have paid? What is fair? And as you can imagine, the numbers vary. But what's fascinating, over the past decade, and talking about these three different groups of people from high school up to graduate school, so many of them come in at the same answers. For the poor, they come in around a couple percent, maybe as high as 5%. Some people go down to 0, but typically 2 to 3% they'll come in. They'll say that's fair. For the middle class, they'll come in around 10 to 15%. That's fair. For the rich, actually, I get the most agreement about the top 1%. That comes in around 30%. Some crazy people will say 0 and other crazy people will say 100, but the vast majority come in around 30%. So I write them down. This is what you have told me is fair. Now let's look at what they actually pay. And what they actually pay, those three groups are about right where those numbers are. The top 1% pay about 32%. The middle income pay around 16%. And the bottom 20% pay around 5%. And so I start the conversation by having a reality check and then saying, okay, now, this statement about the rich should pay their fair share is clearly off the table because you've told me what fair is and I've just shown you this is what they're actually paying. So now where do we go from here? And it causes the person to think a little more clearly, less like a magic wand of, well, let's just tax these people and we can get whatever we want. You got to think a little more deeply about it.
When we have these conversations at my house, I try to talk about football instead. Because these things always come up in the context of a holiday meal. And some things you just shouldn't be talking about at Thanksgiving. We should all be trying to maybe get along for a minute. But in the cold light of day, when people say fair share, like you, I say, okay, what's the fair share? Tell me. And you could demonstrate that what they think is fair has been happening for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So people haven't really thought the issue through, at least not to the point where they would go and get some information. They just like to make pronouncements, which you can talk them off a pronouncement if you've got the right answers at hand. But what I find is that my mother-in-law doesn't believe me. No matter what I say, she says, you're stupid. And there's nothing I can do with that.
My question is, how would you respond to someone who thinks that big companies like Amazon and Walmart are basically evil, greedy, and do more harm to society than good?
This was my father's argument last time I was at his house, and he's utterly convinced that Amazon is the most evil thing in the world. Meanwhile, I think Amazon is what got me through the lockdowns without killing anyone, that we still had access to things that we've needed. Amp will say this a lot, right? All economists will. If you think Amazon is evil, don't use their services. To my father's credit, he doesn't. He makes his call, and that's fine. And I think in a market, that's an easy thing to say. When we get to politics, it's not, but at least in the market, it is.
Prior to COVID, we were picking on Walmart. Walmart was the evil corporation, which always baffled me because Walmart brought low prices to poor people. The poor people had access to variety of products and low prices that they didn't have prior to Walmart. Did Walmart make a lot of money? Of course they did. Remember, their profit margin's 2%, but it was 2% of hundreds of billions of dollars. That's why they have billions of dollars, right? So to Amazon. If it weren't for Amazon, I think much of America couldn't have gotten through COVID because we couldn't go to the store.
Those dudes were coming to my house so often that we left candy bars out for them.
Here's the problem that we suffer from when we talk about stuff like this. We only see half of the picture. You see the billions of dollars that Amazon makes or Walmart makes or whatever it is. You see their stock price and all of this. And in our minds, I know what's going on. We're seeing dollars leaving our pockets and going to Amazon and Walmart. What we aren't seeing is the other half of that transaction. There were goods and services that went from Walmart and Amazon to our pockets. We never look at that. We only look at the dollars. But it's the goods and services that matter. We got lots of stuff in exchange for these dollars. In fact, the value, the goods and services we got were worth more than our dollars. How do I know that? Because we voluntarily exchanged our dollars for the goods and services. We ended up with the better half of the deal. And to someone who says something like, Jeff Bezos has billions of dollars, he should give back half of them. Okay, fine. Then we need to give back half of the stuff we bought from Amazon because that was the other half of the transaction.
It's interesting how short-sighted we are, too. Right now, Amazon is evil and with a Walmart chaser. We don't think about Walmart nearly as much as we once did. If you cast your mind's eye back a little further, it was Kmart. Kmart was evil. Before that, it was Sears. How do I know they're not evil? They make everybody happy. To the extent they don't, they disappear.
Right.
And everybody says, well, Amazon is too powerful. Tell me about Sears. Were you whining about Sears and Kmart? Because it filled roughly that same portion of the market. And when we decided it wasn't good enough, when we took our dollars back into our pockets, they all went out of business. I'm convinced I will live long enough to see Walmart and Amazon go out of business. I know this will happen. It seems incredible to even think about it. But think about how everybody used to say things like, AOL is monopolizing the market. Who the hell's using AOL at this point? I had Earthlink long gone. And you can go after company after company after company. Gone. What do we all have now? Something way better that's actually cheaper. And we're going to get even better next year. I'm convinced that I'll see the day when Google is no longer that important.
Right. Put it on your calendar. We all come back here 10 years from now. I guarantee you, Amazon will no longer be a concern to anybody. There'll be something else better that came along. We'll all be pulling our hair out saying, oh my God, look at this thing. With one possible exception. And the exception is if Amazon somehow gets government protection. If the government steps in and protects Amazon, it'll still be here 10 years from now, and we'll have legitimate complaints. The reason Amazon will go away is because absent government protection, the instant it stops giving us what we want at prices we're willing to pay, we walk away. And when we do, it withers.
And this is an interesting thing in Walmart terms. The story went that Walmart pays its employees so poorly that it's kind of like indentured servitude. And some bright light at the Walmart home office said, you know what? That's right. We're now in favor of a $15 minimum wage because Walmart can pay that. And all the companies that would try to compete with them can't. And this is what we mean by government protecting you. And I suspect we're going to see a fair amount of it because these guys have big coffers that they can dedicate to the purpose. On that happy note, thanks for giving us an hour or so of your time. Thanks for coming. That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. You can join Backstage, where the conversation continues, on the Facebook. And
you can send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
And Ant, you should be thrilled to know that now Nigerian princes have gotten a hold of the Words and Numbers email. And I'm getting
offers for all sorts
I'm
of
getting
things.
a flood of nonsense each and every day. I'm going to have to set up a filter to keep it out of my inbox. That's how ridiculous it's getting. Anyway, he said, irritated. That's probably all we've got this week. Except, look, Christmas is just days away. You got 3 days before aunts and uncles stream into your house with the sole duty of pissing you off. And think about it. You know what they're going to do. Don't fall for it. Just be nice to each other. And if you have awful relatives and you're nice to them, it makes them crazy in the head.
Or it makes them nice.
No, it doesn't ever make them nice, but it does make them crazy because they show up looking for a fight. Don't give it to them. Be nice. Watch football. Have a great Christmas. And I'll catch you later. Happy Christmas to you.
See you next week, James. Merry Christmas.